The individualized planning process occurs in three distinct parts. In the middle of those parts is the meeting itself, and it's the shortest portion, lasting an hour or two at most. So it's intensive, but it doesn't represent the most of your effort. The biggest part of this whole process happens before the meeting, and we'll go through that in this module. And then there's work that happens afterwards to follow up, to document, and to implement the plan itself. Part one, and we'll skip through this slide fairly quickly because we're going to dive into it in more detail later on, involves things like reviewing what's happened in the previous year for that person, finding out what their goals, wants, needs, and preferences are, and doing the same thing by talking to the stakeholders in their lives, such as their family, and also establishing any major concerns that might be happening, doing a medical and dental checkup for the person, choosing where we'll have this meeting and the timing of it, choosing who will be there and sending them invitations. And a lot of work goes into preparing what we call a preparatory report and making sure it gets out to people in ample time in advance. We're going to keep a record of all of these processes as we go along so that we can show accreditation organizations that we are actually upholding the principles of inclusion and planning and accountability as we go through them. Then we'll talk about part two, the meeting, such things as how we establish the chairperson of the meeting, the introductions that we have to make around the people, the purpose of the meeting, philosophy of the meeting, any policies that your agency may have, and specific steps or process. The importance of sticking to the agenda, how we can involve a client or manage the behavior of a person who doesn't seem very happy to be there, how we can deal with conflict between people at the table and make sure everybody participates, the work we can do to build true consensus, and the importance of minutes, which turn out to be an important part of everything else I've just said. So this is just a quick glance through part two, the meeting. We'll have a separate video about it. And we'll also have a separate video about part three, the follow-up processes, how we actually complete the individualized service plan document, how we distribute it and to whom, what we do to make sure that staff are properly trained and oriented to whatever came out of our planning, how we make sure that we have the resources and contacts that are involved, and in fact, we'll define what we mean by a resource, what steps we take, and how we monitor, review, and record progress. And again, the importance of keeping records through all of this. As they say, the job ain't done till the paperwork is filed. So let's dive into part one in more detail. One of the most important things we're going to do is go back and review how well we did against last year's goals. Now, this presumes that the person has lived in the agency or been served by the agency for a year or more, because we can then go back and compare against their previous ISP. If the goals were set properly, we'll be able to measure whether or not a person met those goals. Was progress achieved? And if the goals were not fully achieved, we'll be able to not only say whether we got close, but how close we got. And we'll be able to describe why we may not have been able to achieve goals. One of the things that can intimidate people about this process is the idea that setting goals means we're setting ourselves up to be in trouble if we don't achieve the goals. But that's not true. If a goal is not achieved, it isn't always because of something we had control over. We're all living through a circumstance right now where school is temporarily halted by the COVID virus, and certainly that will be an explanation used in many cases for why we didn't achieve things as expected. And we can't always address the issues in the way that we would have expected, but we are going to be expected to show that we have done so to the most extent possible. We'll also start doing some interviewing or research to try and understand what the client's goals are for that year. So we want to meet with the individual if we can, if the person's verbal and able to understand the conversation. We want to interview them using something like the preferences form in your handout package. But this is just one method. I've seen people do drawings, and I've seen people have multiple interviews and record on video or audio. I've seen people do a composite where people cut pictures out of magazines, drew things, pointed and gestured at things that they liked in magazines or movies that they saw. And one of the most important things to do is to really speak to other people who know that individual well, like their family, their friends, staff that have worked with them for a long period of time, and to look back through all of those daily reports and records that have been kept so that you can see what seemed to really turn the person on, so to speak. What did they enjoy over the course of the last year? What activities were most stimulating, or did they seem to be most eager to go and do? And from there, we can sometimes project what they might want to accomplish in the coming year. Whatever we do, we want to make sure we keep a record of it. So it could be that there is a summary of notes kept from a conversation using a form or just a piece of paper that keeps notes, video or audio recording, as we said, or having individuals make pictures and drawings and then keeping those. By the time we're done this whole process, we very literally will have a pretty big binder or file. And often, it includes some pretty random looking things like, for example, scraps of paper from an art class or audio recordings. And it's very important when we're done all this to express goals with the word I at the beginning. So rather than trying to say John will want or John will do, instead we want to express it as an I statement. Now this is sometimes a bit uncomfortable for people if they're working with individuals who are nonverbal and they didn't actually hear the person use that language. But I think of it as a very good barometer of whether or not you feel comfortable that you have a truly client-centered goal. If you can't think of this as something that person would genuinely say for themselves, it should make you pause and think about a better goal. And as I said in a prior video, 3 goals is pretty good. 5 is the limit. Next thing we want to talk about as part of the preparation is the checkups of this individual. Now, unlike yourself, most people don't go to the doctor every single year to get a medical checkup, at least not until they're about 50 when that's recommended. However, the people we will work with will be expected to get at least 1 medical checkup annually, and many of you go to your dentist once every 6 months. As a minimum, we'll expect people to go once every year. So the doctor and dentist or other key doctors such as a psychiatrist, or maybe a person has diabetes and goes to an endocrinologist or other specialist, we want to go and see those people at least once a year and either get a written report for them or take notes of what they have to tell us. In our report that we're going to be doing, we're going to actually include the summaries of those appointments, including the date that they occurred, and we're going to set a date for the next one. We're also going to include the contact information of those medical professionals right in the document, including their address, their phone number. If a person has been on multiple appointments, for example, maybe they've had regular blood work over the course of the year, or maybe they have routinely gone to have their feet cleaned up and examined by a podiatrist, then we're going to keep a log of that and note that in the medical checkup or medical health section of our report. We're also going to do some pre-interviewing with people, and these people are stakeholders such as the family of the individual, people from other programs, the person's CLBC social worker or MCFD social worker, and we really want to make sure that we are getting people's input before the meeting so that when we get there, we truly have a likelihood of building consensus. Too often I see that people make contact with the individuals that are like-minded, people who are easy to talk to, agreeable people. And then they get to the meeting and the one person they didn't call comes with a really different opinion of how things are going. And they torpedo the whole process because it's almost impossible to build consensus. So it's really important to talk to those people most ahead of time and to see if you can truly appreciate and understand respectfully what their concerns are. And we'll talk more about how to navigate through some of those folks when they can be challenging in our portion about how to actually have our meeting. Even though that will happen in the section about the meeting itself, the tools we'll talk about there will fit even for a telephone call. And sometimes people will be difficult to connect with. They won't want to come to the meeting, for example, or won't be able to come to the meeting. So they'll prefer to talk to you via email or talk to you by telephone. We want to really get a sense of what goals matter to those people or what issues are of biggest concern. We want to make sure that we have their perspectives on progress. I've sat at many a meeting where people, for example, from a day program said that somebody was making terrific progress And the people from the group home said that's the exact opposite of the way that they saw things. So we want to come to the meeting with as much of an understanding of where other people may have issues as we can. We're not going to try and change their mind before the meeting. We really just want to make sure that we know what to be prepared for. We also need to think about where the meeting will happen. One of the most basic concerns is that it needs to be private. You're going to have personal discussions about a person that include their medical welfare amongst a whole bunch of other things that are pretty private stuff. So usually it's in a person's home, but sometimes I've seen it happen in places like a person's favorite restaurant on the proviso that there's a section of the restaurant that is not accessible to other people. It needs to be really a person-centered setting, a setting that the individual really likes. And by far the most commonplace is the individual's own home or own program. But even when you're in those places, stop and think about whether or not you're gathering around the kitchen table, which is a much more comfortable place than, for example, gathering in an office or a staff room. It's not always possible to do that. Again, privacy can sometimes be a concern, or distracting noises or activity. But we want to try and find something that's client-centered. And I think it should try to be something that is appropriate for the whole purpose or spirit of the event. So it's not a drab or dry meeting. It should be something that's celebratory and really almost like a birthday party for a person. So I've seen great ideas like picnics and barbecues, or going someplace such as Chuck E. Cheese or Castle Fun Park on a weekday when it's quieter, and having the meeting in one setting and then going enjoying and celebrating progress afterwards or beforehand. And making it fun for everybody is a part of making everybody want to be there. Think about the time when most people will be able to attend. And that can be a real challenge because often stakeholders from the family are at work during the very same hours that the professionals, like social workers, can be there. Typically, we choose the time that's going to be most important and best suited to the client or the supported person. And I would start thinking about their family as the second or other priority. And these days, social workers in CLBC either will adjust or simply don't come, and they may often participate by giving their input ahead of time. In terms of who actually comes to the meeting, this is something where, as much as possible, we want the supported individual to choose. Now, if it's a child, they really don't have a choice of whether their parent comes. And it can be really difficult if a child under 18 really doesn't want their parent to be there. But if that happens, 18 and under, if that happens, then I would suggest you strongly suggest you talk to your supervisor and get some help in navigating that. Occasionally, parents and children are emancipated from each other. In other words, a child is legally separated from his or her parents. But unless that circumstance exists, the parent has a legal right to participate in the planning process. In fact, they have a right to be there, and the child may not have that right. But with an adult, a person who's 19 or older, it is their right to be at the meeting and to decide who else is there. I think it's very, very important that we never accidentally influence a person to not invite their family or stakeholders, even if those stakeholders are sometimes difficult for us to deal with. And I've seen that happen, which is why I take a few moments to talk about this. You know, it can be really easy to be judgmental and angry at parents, but remember, they have been with that person and will be with that person for the rest of that person's life. They know them best, and they have gone through a lot of frustration in dealing with the system. So it's not personal if they're angry or insistent or persistent. It's very important to try and maintain respect for that person, even if it's challenging. So don't try to encourage or manipulate an individual into not inviting their family. In fact, it's better to try and think about ways that you could make things work for everybody. One of the things you need to be aware of is that often in these families, divorce and separation are real. And so it might be an important thing to think about whether or not two parents are comfortable being in the room at the same time. And you might need to do a little bit of mediating or navigating to see who would be most comfortable being in the room and who might participate in another way if it comes to that. Some of the other people that might be there include friends and advocates. They might be people that the person knows from community clubs or lifelong friends, even their own siblings or coworkers. And believe it or not, there are groups out there that are self-help type groups, such as for people who have borderline personality disorder or for people who have FAS, and they may have made friends within those groups who are more experienced with the system and who may be willing to be there. Another example is a sponsor or mentor in a 12-step program. It's really important that these people be there, and if the client wants them, then I want you to try and make it happen. The client himself has a choice to attend. They can attend for part of the meeting, they can attend for none of the meeting, or they can attend in a specific way. So it's really important to try and find what's going to work for that person. Don't forget about other stakeholders that might need to be there. The most important are other programmers. So for example, if you're running the group home or a family care home or home share, you want to invite the day program. Or if you're the day program, you want to invite the residential program. There may be life skills workers. There may be outreach workers. There may be recreational staff. But where we typically don't invite people are medical people. Typically, those folks, we get their input before the meeting through those medical checkups we spoke of, because it's very cumbersome to expect people like doctors, specialists, therapists, and pharmacists to show up at all of these meetings. So typically, we would consider those people to be resource people as opposed to stakeholders. When we have decided on that list of invitees, we come up with the best way to invite people. And I've seen people do things that are very creative, such as sending out something similar to a birthday invitation or sending postcards. It doesn't have to be a drab email. It can be, and it can be a written note as well. But it should be something that is suited to the individual and sort of speaks to their personality. It could be a telephone call as well, but it's important that if you do this, you make sure you keep a record of those invitations. And if you've made a telephone call, you need to make a note afterwards that you phoned the person and the time and date of that call. And that's going to be important to gain for those people who come and do auditing processes on behalf of accrediting agencies. So it's really important for you to make sure that it's something that's client-centered, and because of that, the language we use should again be those I statements, should reflect the notion of celebration and planning. Those are the two key ideas. And we want to make sure that we are doing it in a way that sounds like that person. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and write a sample of what you might think a good invitation would sound like. In this case, you don't need to post it on Facebook. We'll have a conversation about it later on one of our Zoom calls and get you to read it out for feedback from others. You're also going to complete a report. And this report is outlined in your handout package, and it's called the Planning Preparation Report or Preparatory Report. It has to be done before the meeting, and it has to be done amply enough time for people to actually truly be able to review it. It's one of the biggest issues from my perspective that people will do this report and send it out on the day of the meeting. And that's a terrible practice because you're really telling people, I don't actually want your input. I don't actually want you to be informed. Another reason it's important to give people in advance is that they will be expected to read it. We're not going to read it during the meeting. We are going to use it loosely as the agenda format or the process by which we go through our meeting. And we'll speak more about that later on. So what you've included in there really, really matters if you're going to have a smooth meeting. It begins in each of the domains by summarizing the person's past year. Especially it looks at how they have done in comparison to the goals that were set before this. Remember, if a person's new to your program, it might be a story of their intake, how long they've been there, where they were before, and how they transitioned in. You're also going to propose future goals. We're going to start talking about the idea of long-term and short-term goals here in brief. Long-term goals are in the distant future, more than 1 year away. They could be 5 years, 10 years, or an indeterminate number of years away. And because of that, they do not have to be SMART Plus. Short-term goals is the same as saying a goal that is between 3 and 12 months. In other words, a 1-year goal. And those are the ones that we're going to really focus on the most. Your long-term goals probably don't change that much. For example, I would imagine some of your long-term goals are to travel a lot, or to have a family, or to own your own home. And those have varying degrees of specificity, and they don't have, probably anyways, specific hard dates. But your short-term goals probably do have not only dates, but you can see how they're steps towards a larger goal. For example, completing our course might be a step towards your goal of traveling or of owning a home. So those need to be SMART Plus. And you'll see as you look at the format that you'll be expected to have both long-term or LTGs and short-term goals or STGs. And yes, one of the most common questions that get asked is, do the STGs have to be sort of a step towards the LTGs? And the answer is yes. Once again, a reminder that this report must be client-centered. It must be the sorts of things that you wouldn't mind having written about you. My guess is that you would want language that was dignified to be in your report. My guess is that there are certain domains, such as your sex life or your hygiene, that you would want people to either avoid talking about or to talk about very delicately in a very respectful way. So I'll expect you to try to do the same thing. And yes, a planning preparatory report will be part of what is expected in your Scott project. The 5 domains that are dealt with in the prep report are these. The first is the health, safety, and fitness domain. This is where you would include the very specific information about medical checkups, such as the doctor's contacts, the dates of the meetings or the appointments and the next dates, as well as a summary of what the doctor said or other medical professional. The next domain is the home domain. Here we would talk about things like a person's personal living skills, such as their hygiene, their cleaning skills, their ability to cook. Whether or not their accommodations are what they like, things like the way their room is decorated or furnishings, or whether or not their home is in some way comfortable enough for them. Perhaps we talk a little bit about how they get along with their roommates. We have to be very careful with this one so that we don't get into the private information of other people. Make sure you use initials or other ways of identifying people, such as saying John's male roommate or John's upstairs roommate. And we also want to talk about the person's work and or school. This can include things like volunteer work. If our client is attending a day program or is going to school, sometimes we range with the people who are professionals in that environment to simply send us this section for them to summarize it, and we poured it in. And in your case, you can fictionalize this part. What about the community involvement? This includes the activities they do outside the home, their ability to navigate the community, things like using bank machines, libraries, grocery stores, how well they can walk around or use transit, their safety skills, that sort of thing. And finally, their social and communication domain, things like their social skills and opportunities, the connections they have with friends and family, things that they may have gotten to do with those people or want to do with those people in the coming year, how well they cope emotionally and any behavioral challenges. And again, here we need to be really delicate in ensuring we use dignified language. The idea is to be thinking of ways to help a person meet their need, not to create shame or blame. We want to make sure when we write this report that the language you use is consistently professional. For those of you who did the progress report in the module before we went on Christmas break, you'll remember that some of the same ideas matter here. Avoid flag words, words that inflame people. Again, these are words that lack dignity. Avoid words that are slang sounding or jargony. Do use I statements again, just like our goal setting before. Use language that is progressive, that describes the way a person has changed in the last year. Remember, there are 5 ways to talk about change. They are that a person is improving or increasing in an area, a person is decreasing or reducing in an area, and that might mean that things are getting worse or that something is better because there are less issues. People start things. People end or graduate from things. And sometimes the statement of change is that things haven't changed much at all. So for example, we might say that people are still doing something or that they continue to do something. So those are the 5 different dimensions of progress we might talk about. We don't talk about what a person is, we talk about a person's change. When we talk about a person is, Mike is a man who likes hockey would be a statement of a profile. Mike went to 3 hockey games this year, which was an improvement of 2 from the previous year, would be a description of a progressive statement. Again, they're written in language that is positive, enthusiastic, and dignified. We don't want to be dishonest or paint a rosier picture than is accurate, but we also don't want, again, to create shame or blame. The total length of the report, 3 to 5 pages, and that's somewhat different than what your handout says, but this is the number I'd like you to use. Each domain includes these sections. So you have the 5 domains, and the medical domain has this additional information about their checkups. But in every single case, including the medical domain, you're going to go in this order through a description of the person's past year and their current progress. Where are they now as related to last year's goals? This will probably be the longest portion of each of the 5 sections. Then a brief description of their strengths and resources. For example, is their motivation really high? And do they have lots of support? Do they have money? Do they have a bus pass? What things are working for them? Next, what needs or wants has the person expressed or demonstrated? And if they have multiple in this area, describe what is a priority and explain why. Then, describe what the person's long-term goal or goals are in this area. Notice the word suggested. I expect it to be in your report because the idea of the meeting is to reach consensus. So we're not prescribing this to people, we're suggesting it for discussion. And again, these are not Smart Plus, and they are for more than 1 year in the future. They don't need to have a specific date. Then your suggested short-term goals. These are for a year or less, somewhere between 3 and 12 months. They must be Smart Plus, and they must be in some way a step towards the person's longer-term goal. Okay, that's going to end this video, and I'm going to strongly suggest to you that your team begin here. Really begin by developing a case study-based prep report for Scott, and that you redeem one of your tickets to see whether or not you're on the right track. Now, we're not going to worry too much about the number of tickets here because of the format that we're having to work in. So I'm not going to actually make you cash in tickets. I'm not going to actually count tickets. I'm going to encourage you to check in with me as you go along. And I'm going to be more than comfortable with answering questions with the process because we don't have the easy access we would normally have in the classroom. So begin with an outline with some basic ideas, and then that will help you to see what questions you might have, and I would encourage you to then ask those questions. All right? In our next video, we'll start talking about the meeting itself. But for now, that ends part 1.